in this article that you just wrote, um, can we have a intelligent adult conversation about Russia?
I found
You
out the
go.
answer is no, by the way. The answer is no.
If anybody was in suspense about whether we
I
could
was
do
checking when I wrote that, and then I discovered
the result of the experiment. The result of the experiment was we absolutely could not have an intelligent adult conversation about Russia, as I think that the tweets that we're about to look at verify. It is striking, actually. So when I had the earlier in the day that Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, I was in Austin, and I had this conversation with Joe Rogan, and I believe that we have a clip from the very end of that conversation. So remember, Putin had not yet invaded, but we were just talking about the strong possibility, that this that something like this was going to happen, or at least that there was the standoff going on over Ukraine that could end up in all sorts of bad places.
Is this when you discussed Panama as well? During that clip? Okay.
Yep.
When the United States invaded Panama, I think that was totally unjustified. But, like Gorbachev, wasn't like involving himself, in that, right? Because the Soviet Union didn't have that role in the world. And I'd rather that we didn't either. I'd rather that, like, instead of having like however many hundreds of military bases the United States has all over the entire, like every part of the world right now, and constantly fighting these like low-level drone wars that like most Americans have like forgotten that they're even happening, in distant countries. Like, I think that if we redirected the kinds of resources that we spend on having this role in the world to taking care of people's material needs in ways that, it wouldn't fund all of it, but it would do a lot. It would do a lot.
And one of the things I've learned since having that conversation is that it's not okay to make that analogy. That other countries that the United States invaded cannot be analogized to Russia invading Ukraine. Because if you raise those analogies, apparently you're guilty of a very serious crime called whataboutism.
Indeed.
So whataboutism is the sin of asking what about and then bringing up something bad that the United States did. And this is a Soviet propaganda technique that people are not allowed to engage in. I mean, that is out of bounds when discussing Russia and Ukraine.
Oh, who's the guy who genuinely said it's a Soviet propaganda technique? This is not you being sarcastic. This is I forget who the guy is, but says literally this is a USSR rhetorical tactic.
Yeah, so this is actually a really striking example. I think I actually don't think this is in the many tweets that we have prepared, but this is there's an MSNBC commentator. Ayman is his first name. Ayman Madavi, I want to say. He's like a Egyptian American MSNBC commentator, and this is a guy who's not like some rabid Chomskyian. I mean, he works for MSNBC. This is somebody who's occasionally called in to substitute for Rachel Maddow when she has a night off. So, and I think he's probably a little bit better on certain sorts of foreign policy things, Palestine, than most people at MSNBC. But like his views don't seem to be out of the norm for what people think on that network overall. Like I've seen clips of him talking about Russiagate, the Mueller investigation, and sounding exactly like any MSNBC guy. His commentary on January 6th, etc. It's like nothing is. He did a segment a week before the invasion called "Why Americans Should Care About Ukraine," but he tweeted that it's. I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin or what he's doing in Ukraine, but the
He says it's hard to lecture Russia about violating a country's sovereignty when in 2003 we invaded Iraq under a false pretext that we entirely made up on our own.
Yes, and in response to this, there's this NPR editor who explained that what Ayman Modavi was doing here is the classic Soviet propaganda technique of whataboutism, because he brought up Iraq when talking about Ukraine, and you just can't do that, right? You can't raise or think about anything that the United States has done that's bad when talking about bad things that Russia has done. And I can understand saying it's bad to bring up bad things the United States has done for the purpose of excusing bad things that Russia has done. That makes sense. But it seems like you just can't bring them up at all. That they have that these are just like exiled from the conversation. When it actually strikes me that it would, seems to me that it would actually be incredibly useful if you're interested in seeing if you're applying consistent standards to think about things that that other countries have done, and what, like if you're raising questions like what should the United States do to Russia to punish Russia for doing this, then if that's the context in which we're talking, then saying, well, okay, hold on though, what about, if you're saying, I don't know, Tony Soprano is having a falling out with Johnny Sack, and Tony says, well, clearly I should move in on Johnny's territory and punish him because he's committed all these murders. It strikes me that a not out of line response would be, hold on, Tony, haven't you also murdered a lot of people?
It's an important test. What about is a very important test of whether the thing that you're claiming as the reason for your actions is something that you sincerely believe on principle, or is just opportunism that you apply solely to your adversary. To actually believe the thing that you're saying. If the thing that you're saying is aggressive war needs to be punished with economic ruin for the country that engages in aggressive war, that's a principle we could hold. The question is, well, what about, to test the principle, we say, well, what about the United States and Iraq? Do you believe that the United States should have been subjected to the same levels of sanctions? Do you believe? And there were Russians quoted, the New York Times was talking to Russians about the sanctions, and they said, well, we don't, in some standing in line at some mall, they said, well, we don't think it's very fair because the United States invaded Iraq. Now, the question is it fair? And I think the answer is, when you ask what about, you find out, no, it isn't fair. Now, maybe it's still the thing you want. You can go and say, well, we probably should have done that in the US too. It is very legitimate, but they have a point. And so this is how you test principles.
Yeah, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, logic professor and everyone, but they're treating it like a logical fallacy, which is not. It's really just a strategy to deflect. So when you're deflecting, you're not necessarily, when people are using it wrong, right? So they're pointing it out like, oh, that's a straw man or something like that. When really it's a valid thing to say. It depends on how you're using it. You know what I mean? Like, why are you using it just to deflect because you want to defend it, or are you using it to actually do a substantial critique of our policy? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I feel like they're conflating those two.
And I should say, these are not people I always agree with about, there are times when, we've had Twitter interactions that have been great in the past, etc. But there's a podcast, which I do think does good work, called Citations Needed, that did an episode about whataboutism. And one of the things that they point out is that, the phrase, it was originally whataboutery, because it was a British thing. Whataboutery was coined not actually with in reference to anything about the Soviet Union, but about Irish Republicans, bringing up, what about, like if you're going to talk about all the horrors perpetrated, as a result of IRA bombings, what about all these things the British Army has done? And it seems like the critique of whataboutism, I mean, like whataboutism strictly defined would be an actual logical fallacy, which is the appeal to hypocrisy. You're being a hypocrite, therefore you're wrong. It could be that you're being a hypocrite and you're right. You should just, you should just apply it in the other direction. But in like a context like that, why read it that way? Right? Like it doesn't actually, it could just be that somebody's making a perfectly legitimate point, which is, well, hold on, the bad things done by the IRA are not necessarily good reason to hope that the British Army wins, because look at all the terrible things that it does also. And it's not like Jay Hutch talks too much, says, I thought the British version was what's all this then, isn't it? You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.